This first piece that we're going to be hearing by Joaquín Turina, while it's Spanish, I think you'll find that it has a lot of French garnishings, because Turina, like many of the great Spanish composers who lived in the early part of the 20th century, like these ones who are scrolling by on the screens on the sides of the stage, he spent 9 years living in Paris during the formative years of his life, from 1905 until 1914. And he came under the influence of Debussy and Ravel, and also composers like Vincent d'Indy. And I think that is audible. You'll hear an impressionist overlay to this music. The piece that we're going to hear, the Bullfighter's Prayer, was not originally written for string quartet. It was originally written for a quartet of Spanish lutes. There was this ensemble, the Quarteto Aguilar, which was a family ensemble, and they were all apparently outstanding lutenists, to the point where they attracted many great composers, both Spanish and Northern European, who wrote a lot of music for them. Stravinsky wrote a lute quartet for them. It's a suite. And of course, Turina, the piece we're going to hear, and Manuel de Falla wrote. There was quite a repertoire that they developed. And then in the late 1930s, with the Civil War going on, they fled from Spain and they kind of disbanded. About 50 years later, in the mid-1980s, they were reincarnated by a later group of Spanish lutenists, and they apparently decided that they wanted to resurrect this repertoire that had been written for the original Quarteto Aguilar. And I'll play you their, that is to say, the later groups, recording a little of it, of the original version of the piece we're about to hear for Spanish-style lutes. You can very clearly hear the Spanish influence. But even Turina, shortly after he wrote this piece, began to realize that if it was going to have any sort of a life outside of Spain, he was going to have to reorchestrate it for a more conventional ensemble. And so he rewrote it, I should say, for string quartet, and then for a large string ensemble with double bass. And in this form, I think you really can hear the influence of that time that he spent in Paris, because it has this impressionist, lush overlay. And as far as why it's called the Bullfighter's Prayer, apparently in the major bullfighting rings of Spain, and particularly there in Madrid where he lived, there are, built into the architecture of these arenas, chapels where the bullfighters can go and they can pray for their lives before they go out and risk them at the hooves and the horns of the bulls. And before we play it, you can see this lovely picture painted in about 1900 of one of these chapels. And I will read you this very evocative description by Turina himself of how he came to write this piece. He wrote, "One afternoon at a bullfight in the Plaza de Madrid, that old, harmonious and charming square, I saw my work. I was in the horse patio. There, behind a small door, was the chapel, filled with devotion, where bullfighters came to pray for a moment before facing death. At that moment, the subjective, musical, and expressive contrast presented itself in all its fullness. The distant clamor in the plaza, the anticipation of the festive crowd, juxtaposed with the solemnity of those who, before the altar, humble and full of endearing poetry, came to plead with God for their lives, perhaps for their souls, for the pain, for the illusion, and for the hope that they might leave behind forever in those moments in that arena filled with laughter, music, and sunlight." So this piece is a very evocative musical depiction of those very evocative words that Turina wrote. Enjoy it.